Good morning, everyone. I'm Reza Pirbhai. Dr. Babar has said I should introduce myself. She's not going to be bothered to stand up and give any introductions. I think I know everybody here. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces. Today's lecture, continuing the series on 1919 in the world, is on anti-colonialism in British India. And the central point of this lecture ultimately is to illustrate that 1919 was a pivotal year in South Asian history. To make this point, I would ultimately have to begin with a short discussion of the making of British India itself. In 1919, South Asia was under British rule. British India, also known very widely as the British Raj. Go on from there to talk a little bit about colonial institutions and the manner in which they impacted South Asian society. A very good example of that impact, in fact, is the rise of national movements. And as you see, it's nationalisms rather than nationalism that we need to talk about when speaking of South Asia during this period. Then a little rundown on the politics of World War I as they unfolded in South Asia. And then we can talk a little bit, or hopefully the majority of the talk, on the Khilafat and non-cooperation movements which arose in 1919 and played a very important role in shaping the decades to come and ultimately also in the fruition of the nationalist movements so far as the creation of India and Pakistan are concerned. So without further ado, if we speak of the making of British India, we have to first and foremost consider the fact that British Empire in South Asia was not a British government endeavor, but rather one that began with the founding and activity of a joint stock company, the English East India Company. It was the second joint stock company we know in world history, in fact, the first being the Dutch East India Company. British merchants came together and modeled this company, in fact, exactly on the Dutch East India Company. Their intent was to follow the Dutch, who themselves had followed the Portuguese, who had arrived about a century earlier, into the Indian Ocean to explore markets and to purchase goods that were in high demand in the Western European market. We speak in terms of the spice trade, but in fact we can speak more broadly of different types of textiles and linens, metalwares, a number of different types of products, both raw and manufactured. To avail themselves of these markets and to be able to trade within them, being so far away from their home countries, whether Holland or Britain or Portugal, required a more settled presence in these regions. And the manner in which this was ultimately accomplished was to set up what are known as factories, not to be confused with manufacturing centers. These referred to a place where factors or agents of the company would be based and would ultimately be granted some concession of land by the local authority, whoever it was. We see factories right through South and Southeast Asia, in fact. When they're given the concession, what we start to see in these centers of trade is ultimately offices being set up for company representatives, warehouses, in certain factories that were larger, shipbuilding facilities, places to repair their ships and so on. And as we move forward as well, and I'll be talking about this a little bit more when talking about the Sepoy Army, barracks as well for troops. The basic problem for the English East India Company in particular was competition from the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the French, who were pursuing very much the same interests in the region, and all of them also wanted to corner the Western European market for goods coming from the Indian Ocean region. Competition between them, in fact, was extremely fierce. This was not just about a trade war, but an armed conflict that mirrored the alliances and conflicts that were ongoing between some of these powers in Europe itself. So what this meant is that the companies from a very early stage were also armed to various degrees. The Dutch East India Company was the most powerful during the 1600s. By the 1660s, the Dutch East India Company had 40 warships and over 10,000 soldiers in its employ working in the Indian Ocean alone. So the British and the latecomers in this scene, the French, were moved to think in very much the same lines, and the fighting between them, as I said, was ferocious. There are a number of different examples of the Dutch, for example, attacking English factories and massacring everyone in them, or the English attacking Dutch factories, and so on, until we reach 1665, when the Dutch and the English signed the Treaty of Breda. Basically, they recognized by this time that the warfare and conflict between them was not fruitful for their trading interests, and under these treaties, the Dutch basically were agreed with the British that Southeast Asia would be primarily their domain. 2/3 of the trade with Western Europe would be monopolized by the Dutch East India Company. Meanwhile, South Asia would be the primary stomping grounds for the English. 2/3 of trade with South Asia would be monopolized by the English East India Company. The big loser, of course, would be the French, who were pretty much shunted into the background by the two big companies that were operating, and many of their early endeavors anyway during the 1600s were total failures. It's not until we get to the 1700s that the French really have any major presence. So given the nature of the competition that between these European companies, armies were necessary, and the manner in which these armies were constituted became known as the sepoy army. In fact, the Portuguese themselves, even at an earlier stage, the Portuguese, by the way, did not arrive represented by a company of any kind. They flew the flag of Portugal and later of Spain. But the companies themselves, very much like the Portuguese even, would hire local manpower, local soldiers, local forces who were seasonally employed by the states that had power within South Asia, the indigenous states, looking for a way to supplement their incomes and so on. And these armies under these companies, therefore, grew to a pretty significant size by the 1700s. But by the 1700s as well, the Dutch and the English East India Companies had kind of stabilized their relations. They had ultimately dealt with French competition sufficiently to be comfortable enough to start thinking about expanding their operations. And at the same time, what we see in the early 1700s is the collapse of the major political player in South Asia, the Mughal Empire. The map up here shows you basically what the heartland of the Mughal Empire was, the inner ring there, roughly around the 1530s. By the turn of the 17th century, 1605 or so, the empire had expanded to cover basically everything from modern-day Burma or Myanmar all the way west to Afghanistan and eastern parts of Iran. And by the turn of the 18th century, it had expanded all the way south to what's today Tamil Nadu in India. It had lost some territories, however, in Afghanistan, southern Afghanistan around Kandahar and so on. But anyway, major, major power. What's interesting, however, is that at the peak of its territorial sovereignty over South Asia, uniting the entire region of South Asia under its rule, the Mughal Empire was also at its weakest. And one of the reasons why it was at its weakest at this point, in fact, has to do with trade. It's almost a counterintuitive fact that historians, economic historians in particular, have pointed out, that the decline of the Mughal Empire was ultimately a function of the success of the trading networks that were in place during this time and growing under Mughal rule. By the turn of the 18th century, in fact, we have major structural changes taking place in South Asia that have a very important role to play in the rise of nationalism and the contemporary states in South Asia. Most importantly, the rise of a capital holding class that had enriched itself by means of participation in all of these different trade networks. So what we would commonly refer to as bankers and entrepreneurs, people who were petty landlords, whose holdings were providing the raw materials for the markets that existed in the Indian Ocean, manufacturing centers as well. As I said, textiles were one of the most important exports, and so there were major stakeholders in terms of the production of textiles, which was also evolving beyond cottage industry into wage labor and what we could call in that sense proto-industrialization. All of this created, in other words, a highly capitalized economy, and that capital was also partly there because of the discovery of the Americas, massive silver reserves that were then being used by the English and the French and so on to buy the goods that they wanted from the Indian Ocean region. All of this money was pouring into South Asia. Some economic historians argue that in the year 1700, South Asia actually accounted for 1/3 of the world's gross domestic product. So huge amounts of money, creating whole new classes in society who then felt, why should we pay taxes to the Mughal Empire, which exists so far, the capital is so far away. We're sitting here in the south, in the Deccan, or in the east, in Bengal. We're better off alone. And so very often this capital was channeled into local governorial classes who were otherwise appointed by the Mughals. And this encouraged them to separate from the Mughal Empire, declare their independence in one way or another. And it's quite startling to see that in 1707, the empire was at its greatest extent, and by 1725, it basically was non-existent. It had broken up into all of its constituent parts, different states arising, and what that meant now was competition between these different states. And how do we tie this now into the Sepoy army? Well, the British and the Dutch have basically come to terms with each other. They both have huge armies. The British are primarily present in South Asia. What do we do with this army? Let's use it to make money. So how are we going to use this army to make money? Well, let's rent it out to all of these local states that are fighting with each other, and that will generate revenues from a different source other than the trade that's going on. So, as we move into the mid-1700s, therefore, what we start to see is that the East India Company is becoming more and more engaged in the politics of South Asia, and particularly on these local levels, with these successor states playing a heavy hand in terms of the financing of the East India Company, alongside local entrepreneurs and bankers and so on, who are also heavily involved with East India Company trade, very often also providing finances for the East India Company. What this ultimately leads to is a stake in who rules in different parts of South Asia. And one of the most important parts of South Asia for the English East India Company, one of its earliest factories or territorial interest was in the east, in Bengal. The governor of Bengal had broken away from the Mughal Empire in the 1720s, 1730s. By the 1750s, the incumbent ruler decided, I'm not interested in dealing with the East India Company, the English East India Company anymore. I want to balance relations with the French East India Company. The English East India Company took this very badly, saw it as a great threat to its interests, and so ultimately, in a dispute for succession, basically supported someone who said that when he comes to power, he's going to support the English East India Company and kick out the French. Ultimately, this is precisely what happened. The English East India Company's man in Bengal, managed to displace the incumbent ruler, and the French were out. The English were basically granted incredible concessions within Bengal as a result of their service to this new ruler. In fact, from 1756 to 1760, generally speaking, it's referred to as a period of dual government in which the English East India Company was basically collecting all taxes from Bengal for the ruler. What this became formalized as is known as a series of subsidiary alliances, and subsidiary here referring to subsidy, the subsidy that local rulers were paying to the English East India Company for services rendered, particularly use of their sepoy army. Under subsidiary alliances, apart from the subsidies being paid, very often the English East India Company also required that a agent of the company, who became known as a resident, would be part of the cabinet of that state, part of the ministerial classes of that state. So you can see how progressively what we're ultimately commenting on and noting here is that the English East India Company is becoming more and more and more part of the polity of South Asia. It's not now a foreign trading company anymore. It has vested interests in the political machinations of the various states in South Asia. It also recognized that by playing politics in South Asia, it's opening up yet more sources of revenue. Most importantly, land revenue. And this became basically institutionalized in terms of land in lieu of subsidies. So if a state, for example, was hiring the East India Company's sepoy army to engage in a battle with its neighbor, and they lost, well, how are you going to pay me now? Well, give me land. We'll take land from you in lieu of the subsidies that are owned. To this, we can add the temptation very often for coups d'etats, which would happen as well. Oh, the incumbent ruler isn't someone who's favorable to us. Let's get rid of him by supporting someone else. And very often, states would succumb in that manner as well. And then finally, by the 1850s, we have the doctrine of lapse, which is really an interesting development because we see multiple states annexed by the East India Company under this doctrine, which basically argued that if a ruler dies and there isn't a viable heir, the East India Company will take over the government of that state. A good example of this is the state of Awadh around Lucknow in the central Gangetic region. They had an incumbent ruler, they had a viable heir, and so on. But in Awadh, there was a particular cultural convention in which plays were hosted, and this would take place in the court as well of the ruler, in which men would dress up and play the feminine parts, and women would dress up and play the masculine parts. And the ruler played in one of these dramas as well. And the East India Company took this as the pretext to say, well, this is not a viable ruler, and so we need to take over the state. And this was the final straw. This was in 1856 when ultimately not just the people, the ruling classes of Awadh, but also in other states in that central Gangetic region, what had been the heartland of the Mughal Empire, rise up against East India Company rule. In terms of all of South Asia, it's a localized uprising. It's in the Gangetic region. So the vast majority of people under British rule by 1857, on this map, all the pink areas are British India, directly ruled by the East India Company. All the green and, what is that, olive, orange, yellow areas are princely states that are under subsidiary alliances with the East India Company. By the way, there are over 535 of them at this time. And you can see, out of those 535, the green ones are Muslim rulers. And considering that not much earlier than this, you had Muslim rulership across South Asia, you can see how Muslim political power is shrinking and has shrunk to virtually nothing already by this time relative to all of the princely states that are of Hindu or Sikh communities. So anyway, this leads to an uprising in 1857. It's very commonly known as the Great Indian Mutiny, because what we see during this uprising is that members of the Sepoy army themselves, feeling disenfranchised, the Sepoy army did not allow the advancement of indigenous troops into the officer levels. There were widespread reports of discrimination by British officers against their troops and so on. All of this leads to the Sepoy army stationed around Delhi rebelling, marching to Delhi, taking the incumbent Mughal Sultan, who is a powerless figure, basically. He's a pensioner of the East India Company. He has no authority whatsoever, even within Delhi. But saying, we want to revive you and revive the Mughal government. At the same time, various other states, their local rulers and so on, also rose up, not necessarily under the Mughal banner, but as independent states seeking to reassert their authority, break free of subsidiary alliances, or reassert their claims to territory that the East India Company had taken over. The uprising is put down after 1 year of ferocious fighting, and one of the reasons, perhaps the main reason why the English East India Company is successful in putting down the uprising is that the vast majority of the Sepoy army does not rebel. They do not turn their guns on their officers the way the ones in the central lands had. And the vast majority of princely states do not rebel either. They, in fact, provide financial and military support for the East India Company. And so the rebellion is ultimately put down. This brings us then to the Victoria Proclamation issued in November 1858, in which we see the British government ultimately finding the pretext which it has been looking for some time to take over the vast territories that this company has ultimately won for itself. So the pretext is that the rebellion, the uprising, the mutiny, however you want to term it, was caused by gross corruption and mismanagement by the East India Company, and that the British government therefore needs to take control so that good governance can be brought to these possessions. This leads to the period after 1858 known as the period of direct rule. What's interesting when you compare the institutions of the East India Company and those of the British government in South Asia is that they basically continue East India Company institutions with new names. So Queen Victoria now becomes the Empress of India. The Governor General of the East India Company's British Indian holdings is now a viceroy appointed by the British government. The Board of Control of the East India Company basically becomes the India Office, cabinet post within the British government as well, and the Sepoy Army becomes the British Indian Army. So it's basically a transfer of authority from the East India Company to the British government, but the institutions in place stay very much the same, as do the subsidiary alliances with the various local states that were loyal to the East India Company during this fight. Those that were not loyal were dealt with very harshly, as were any of the participants in the uprising itself, were high or low. The last Mughal Sultan, for example, is exiled to Burma, where he dies. The Mughal Sultanate is abolished, and basically the entire Mughal family is executed. There are a number of drawings and images from the time of very large-scale mass executions taking place across the rebellious regions as British power is reasserted. So, what's the agenda? How does this change the picture? If we say the institution stayed the same, we can also say that in terms of ideology, we also see a continuation. It's very much the foundations laid by the East India Company that we see developed further, built upon by the British government. So the manner in which rule is legitimated is commonly recognized as the civilizing mission. So Britain is not there for the economic or political power that it gains from colonialism, but rather to civilize the native, which would be done. This is a quote from the same person that I quote below, Macaulay, Thomas Babington Macaulay. Even before the British government takes over back in the 1830s, the method by which we can civilize is to create a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To do so, you have to create an education system that is going to promote Western or British educational norms and standards as well. Now, the attitudes underlying this are also very well represented by Macaulay's Minute, which was written in 1833 as part of a larger debate about what kind of education the East India Company should be imparting in South Asia. The attitude behind it is, a single shelf of a good European library is worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. All right? This gives you a very good, I think, indication of how this education system would unfold and what the ramifications would be for the local educational institutions that had been patronized by a variety of states for thousands of years in South Asia. They were basically seen as useless. And I use that term very pointedly because Macaulay and others that followed were utilitarian thinkers. So for them, the idea was, and the manner in which they justified the revamping of the education system in South Asia, was to say that local learning has no utility, whereas British learning does have utility. Furthermore, like after the British government takes over, as now we're into 1898, authors such as Kipling, who were pro-empire figures, Kipling's father and he were part of the colonial apparatus in South Asia, penned poems such as The White Man's Burden. This is interesting because it was written and addressed to the United States. The Spanish-American War had just taken place. The US had taken possession of the Philippines and Cuba and so on. And so Kipling wrote this poem basically urging the US to now take up the white man's burden that the English had been carrying. And allow me to just read you one stanza here. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new court sullen peoples, half devil and half child. You can see some images here. The bottom one is basically the white man's burden. As you can see, the Uncle Sam and his British peer carrying the half devil, half child peoples of the world up to civility. We can think of this in another way as well. The image at the top is an interesting one. It's the Victoria Memorial in Calcutta. If you look at it closely, obviously it's a neoclassical style building, but it's white marble and it's full of domes. What does that remind you of? Taj Mahal, right? So this is an assertion of British power. That was then, this is now, all right? And now is European, not Oriental. And so we see on various levels, basically, and I can talk about this for a semester, as some of you know, on various levels, South Asia is transformed by this particular agenda. So how do South Asians respond to all of this? As I said, one of the major ways in which we see the impact of British education is by means of the rise of national movements, nationalist movements. But nationalist movements are part of both social reform and political reform movements. And I'd like to read you a quote from the founder of the Brahmo Samaj in 1828. He died in 1828. Who founded the Brahmo Samaj in 1828. He died only a few years later. A man named Ram Mohan Roy, pictured on the right over there. He was a Brahmin from Bengal. Bengal, remember, is the first part of South Asia that comes under British rule. And so the first population within South Asia that's really exposed to the culture of Britain in one way or another. Ram Mohan Roy founded the Brahmo Samaj as a movement to reform Hinduism. And I would just like to read you a quote from a letter that he wrote, from an introduction to a translation of a Sanskrit work that he wrote, that gives you some sense of how he had internalized and imbibed some of the values of the civilizing mission as it was developing, what he in fact thought of Hindus and Hinduism. Quote, "The advocates of idolatry and their misguided followers, over whose opinions prejudice and obstinacy prevail more than good sense and judgment, prefer custom and fashion to the authorities of their scriptures, and therefore continue under the form of religious devotion to practice a system which destroys to the utmost degree the natural texture of society and prescribes crimes of the most heinous nature which even the most savage nations would blush to commit." This is a Hindu, Brahmin, talking about Hinduism and Hindus, all right? It really gives you a sense of how the classes that are exposed to the British at this early stage, throughout this period, are internalizing, basically self-loathing. Everything that they are, very much the way the the utilitarian said, is useless. And therefore, they are now promoting reform in terms of European inspiration in one way or another, Enlightenment thinking in one way or another, Christianity in one way or another. The Brahmo Samaj basically sifts through all the vast corpus of Sanskrit literature and pulls out from that the very pieces of writing from Vedanta and so on that emphasize monotheism, for example, that emphasize non-image-based worship, that emphasize the equality of classes rather than the caste system, and so on. So in terms of religious reform, we see a movement towards what we could refer to as the Christianization, if you like, of Hinduism. Now, Hindus are not alone here. I can also give you a passage from a Muslim, the man on the left, Syed Ahmad Khan, founder of the Aligarh University in 1875, and one of the greatest Muslim reformers of the time. He traveled to Britain, as did Ram Mohan Roy, by the way. And after having toured Britain, having seen and visited schools, Cambridge and so on, he actually had traveled to Britain to accompany his son, who was a new student at Cambridge. This is what he said, after having seen all this. "The result of all this is that although I do not absolve the English in India of discourtesy, and of looking upon the natives of that country as animals and beneath contempt, I think they do so from not understanding us. And I'm afraid I must confess that they are not far wrong in their opinion of us. Without flattering the English, I can truly say that the natives of India, high and low, merchants and petty shopkeepers, educated and illiterate, when contrasted with the English in education, manners, and uprightness, are as like them as a dirty animal is to an able and handsome man. The English have reason for believing us in India to be imbecile brutes. This is a major reformer who is setting up a university and looking to ultimately uplift Muslim society in South Asia. So we see on every level, and these are just two examples. There are many corollaries I could bring up from various communities, different ethnic groups, and so on, that reflect exactly this idea. But by introducing, first of all, as part of the colonial endeavor, the civilizing mission, and then by the internalization of those values by locals, by introducing these ideas and with the goal ultimately of introducing British education, Victorian education in the 19th century, what we see, therefore, is the creation of a class of people who are, exactly as Macaulay had hoped, English in manner and values and so on. So, part of that education, then, is also an introduction to nationalism, an introduction to the idea of identifying as a nation in one way or shape or form. Particularly the ideas of people like John Stuart Mill and so on in the British Indian context. So what do we see with nationalism? I should say one more thing. Along with nationalism, of course, we have the idea of representative government, right? And as much as Syed Ahmad Khan and Ram Mohan Roy were willing to pursue British education, the British agenda, and so on in terms of social reform, they were also not particularly pleased by the manner in which the British governed, the manner in which they included or did not include South Asians in government. That is the discourtesy that Syed Ahmad Khan refers to. And just to go back to Ram Mohan Roy, so at the earliest stages of the rise of the British Empire, even under the East India Company, Ram Mohan Roy said what many others would say afterwards, including Syed Ahmad Khan. He writes, "In common with those who seem partial to the British rule, from the expectation of future benefits arising out of the connection, I necessarily feel extremely grieved in often witnessing acts and regulations passed by government without consulting or seeming to understand the feelings of its Indian subjects." Right? So this idea of representation also caught on. And when we start to see the rise of national movements, therefore, it's ultimately the idea that these are the means by which we can secure representation within the British system. One of the earliest is the Indian National Congress, founded in 1885. Here's the first president of the Indian National Congress, Allan Octavian Hume. He's an Englishman, all right? He worked very, very hard to try and create a body that would represent the Indian nation. And one of the methods that he used was to write letters to the South Asian faculty members and students at English institutions and say, you know, come and join, let's get together and do something about this. One letter I can just quote a couple of lines from is addressed to graduates of Calcutta University, which was one of the first British universities set up in South Asia. He writes, "You are the salt of the land, and if amongst even you, the elite, 50 men cannot be found with sufficient power of self-sacrifice, sufficient love for and pride in their country, sufficient genuine and unselfish, heartfelt patriotism to take the initiative, and if needs be, devote the rest of their lives to the cause, then there is no hope for India." All right. First president of the Indian National Congress. people heeded the call. A number of these Western-educated classes joined the Indian National Congress from various communities. One such community was the Zoroastrian community. The second president of the Indian National Congress was neither Hindu nor Muslim, but from the very small minority Zoroastrian community centered in Bombay. He, in one of his speeches, starts to address the idea of the Indian nation, and I'd just like to read you again a passage from this to give you a sense of how he's and these early thinkers are conceiving of what India is as a nation. He says, "This assemblage of such a Congress is an event of the utmost importance in Indian history. I ask whether in the most glorious days of Hindu rule, you could imagine the possibility of a meeting of this kind, where even Hindus of all different provinces of the kingdom could have collected and spoken as one nation. Coming down to the later empire of our friends, the Mohammedans, who probably ruled over a larger territory at one time than any Hindu monarch, would it have been possible for a meeting like this to assemble composed of all classes and communities, all speaking one language and all having uniform and high aspirations of their own?" All right, so what we see here is the idea of an India that's inclusive of the Hindu and the Muslim, an India that is united by one language, an India that is ultimately unitary in the manner in which 19th century nationalism defined the nation, a more homogeneous ethnic, religious, linguistic community seeking to establish its political will. Now, what could be wrong with that, right? Syed Ahmad Khan, however, had an objection. The reason why he objected is stated very clearly here in 1888, 3 years after the founding of the Congress. He says, "Long before the idea of founding the Indian National Congress was mooted, I had given thought to the matter whether representative government is suited to the conditions of India. I studied John Stuart Mill's views in support of representative government. He has dealt with this matter exceedingly well in great detail. I reached the conclusion that the first requisite of a representative government is that the voters should possess the highest degree of homogeneity. In a form of government which depends for its functioning upon majorities, it is necessary that the people should have no differences in the matter of nationality, religion, ways of living, customs, mores, culture, and historical traditions. These things should be common among a people to enable them to run a representative government properly. Only when such homogeneity is present can representative government work or prove beneficial. It should not be even thought of when these conditions do not exist. The aims and objects of the Indian National Congress are based on an ignorance of history and present-day realities, for they do not take into consideration that India is inhabited by different nationalities." So in Syed Ahmad Khan's estimation, what we see here then is not a problem with nationalism, not a problem with representative government per se, but rather the fact that it cannot be suited to a united Indian nationalism. That instead, we need to, he's a Muslim, he's been identified by the British state as a member of a minority. What we need is a system of government that is ultimately going to be receptive to the needs of the minority community, whichever community that might be. So what we're seeing here is the birth then of the two-nation theory, the idea that when you're looking at South Asia, you're looking at a Hindu India and a Muslim India. And what's important is ultimately to understand that this understanding of nationalism is ultimately not based in the idea of my religion versus your religion or your religion versus my religion, but rather on the understanding of works such as those of Mill's on nationalism that speak of the homogeneity of the nation in one way or another. And the fear, ultimately, of minorities like Muslims, that as minorities, they are going to be subject to the tyranny of the majority, which is being defined in terms of the Hindu. They have reason to fear. And this brings us to groups such as the Hindu Mahasabha, which I'd like to talk about after I just talk about the Swadeshi movement. In 1905, after a great deal of unrest in Bengal, which was dominated ultimately economically by Hindu merchants, as I said earlier, enriched over the long run by the dealings of trade in the Indian Ocean. Bengal was a place where these were the classes that ultimately had money, whereas the vast majority of people were Muslim and were peasants or artisans. And this led to a great deal of unrest, and ultimately in 1905, the British decided that the best way to deal with this might be to partition Bengal, to take the areas of Bengal which are majority Muslim, create a province out of them, take the areas of Bengal that are majority Hindu and create a province out of them. Foreshadowing Bangladesh or East Pakistan. This created a huge amount of tension, and now we have this nationalist fervor already in place. We have the idea of the Indian nation in place. We have social reformers. The Brahmo Samaj, for example, spoke of India in terms of its great Hindu heritage, and therefore the need to reform Hinduism if the nation is going to proceed. And so more and more, the fear of tyranny of the majority defined as Hindu is ultimately going to come to play and is brought to a head by the Swadeshi movement. Swadeshi means of one's own country, right? And is a Sanskrit word. So the word itself for non-Hindus is an indicator of which way the wind is blowing in terms of the nation and how it's going to be defined. But they go further than that. One of the leaders of the Swadeshi movement was a guy named Aurobindo Ghosh, who in fact becomes very influential in terms of Gandhi's program, which I'll be getting to. He says, he said in one of his speeches, "I spoke once before with this force in me, and I said then that this movement," he's talking about nationalism, "is not a political movement, and that nationalism is not politics, but a religion, a creed, a faith. I say it again today, but I put it in another way. I say no longer that nationalism is a creed, a religion, a faith. I say that it is the Sanatan Dharma, which for us is nationalism." Sanatan Dharma refers to the eternal law, a concept of eternal law in Hinduism. Sharia, basically, of Hinduism. This Hindu nation was born with the Sanatan Dharma, and it moves, and with it, it grows. When the Sanatan Dharma declines, then the nation declines. And if the Sanatan Dharma were capable of perishing, with the Sanatan Dharma, it would perish. The Sanatan Dharma, this is nationalism. All right. So what we see is, within the context of Indian nationalism, then, more and more the idea of a nationalism that centers on defining the nation as Hindu and defining its raison d'etre ultimately as the pursuit and establishment and benefit of Hinduism as a global force. These are the kinds of people. One more thing. The method of the Swadeshi movement to undo the partition of Bengal was successful. The method they used was the boycott of British goods, basically bringing the economy to a standstill. And this is, again, a very influential aspect of the Gandhian movement that will follow as well. But given the Indian National Congress speaking in terms of India belonging to the Hindu and the Muslim and everybody else and so on, this created tension within the Congress, and members influenced by people like Ghosh and the Swadeshi movement broke away to found the Hindu Mahasabha. And here we see the concept of Hindutva, or the Hindu nation, taking center stage. And the Hindu Mahasabha, ultimately, I can just add, is the forerunner of the RSS and the VHP and the BJP, which rules India today. All right. So what we end up with, in other words, in terms of nationalism, is a number of nationalisms. And we can add to the Muslim and the Hindu and the Indian various ethno-linguistic nationalisms, various sub-regional nationalisms, and so on as well, that are now vying for authority over South Asia. Enter World War I. British India mobilized without consulting political parties. So here you have all this, a century of talk of, we need representation. We're happy to have the British. In fact, people like Syed Ahmad Khan and Ram Mohan Roy referred to British rule over India as providential. It's God-given. Yet their calls for representation in government were never heeded. And then World War I comes along, and the British declare British India at war without consulting anybody at all among the South Asian players. The British Indian Army is deployed. During the course of the war, 1.3 million South Asians serve in the war. More than 70,000 die. They're present and serve in France, in Belgium, in Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Turkey, Iraq, Egypt, Palestine, as well as on the borders with Afghanistan, whose allegiances are not too clear. In these pictures, you see this is in Europe, for example. That's in East Africa. This is in Palestine. Above there is one of the recruiting posters put out during this time, and which was part of a very aggressive campaign to recruit troops and send them off to fight in the war. It says, "Who will take this money, rifle, and uniform? Only those who join the army immediately." All right. And please note the black-faced question mark and the white hands holding the money. All right. This is part of the broader recruiting campaign, and ultimately is effective enough. There were 240,000 troops at the start of the war, and 1.3 million people served. So the gun, the money, and this uniform apparently had some appeal. While the war is going on, there are also a number of political developments taking place. Already in 1913, the idea that the Ottoman state is under threat, and that by the Ottoman state being under threat, the Caliph of Sunni Islam is going to be displaced in the future and will no longer be having a role to play in terms of the administration, management, the custodianship over the sacred places of Mecca and Medina, was worrying South Asian Muslims. In fact, it was not just a worry, but it was also seen as a means by which to leverage their Muslimness as a force to bring about British concessions, representation, and so on. We Muslims, you're not just dealing with the Muslims of South Asia, we're part of an ummah, and we have this great empire backing us, and so on, was part of the way in which a Muslim rhetoric was developing at the time, leading to the formation of the Anjuman-e-Khudam-e-Kaaba, which basically means the servants of the Kaaba, the servants of the shrine in Mecca. And their basic idea was that they are going to seek from the English guarantees that if there is a conflict between England and the Ottoman Empire, that the English will respect the sovereignty of the Ottoman Caliph over the sacred sanctuaries in the Hijaz, Mecca and Medina. They petitioned, they had demonstrations and so on as soon as the war began. Meanwhile, the Ottomans and the Germans also took note of this sentiment, and we see the rhetoric of Caliphate and jihad being used throughout the war by the Ottomans. In fact, we see the Ottomans establish newspapers published in Constantinople in Urdu, and hire South Asian staff to come and staff these newspapers and so on as well. Meanwhile, the Germans promise aid for independence. They too have taken note of this want for representation and moving forward in terms of the autonomy of South Asian subjects. And they say, well, back us and we will ultimately help you get independence in the long run if we win the war. And many people heed this call. During the war, there are a number of mass defections from the British Indian Army over to the Ottoman army as well, particularly in the Mesopotamian front, in Palestine as well. The British respond by initiating the Defense of India Act in 1915. This basically takes away all civil liberties. It is the Patriot Act of World War I. Special tribunals established to intern subjects deemed anti-British. Leaders of the Anjuman Khuda of Kaaba are arrested, put in jail, sent off in exile, and so on, among 800 others that are deemed to be quote-unquote terrorists. Deoband is a very important seminary just outside Delhi, and its leaders are watching all of this happening. And after the Arab revolts in 1916, after the Sykes-Picot Accord, and the idea that now Palestine is going to become a Zionist state in the future, with the diminishing support for the Ottomans and the Sharif of Mecca being acknowledged as king of Hijaz, independent of the Ottomans. All of these different issues lead a number of very important clerics to declare jihad against the English, justified on the grounds of the Quranic quote, "Whoever intentionally kills a believer, their reward is an eternity in hell." So Muslims, in other words, should not be part of any army that is fighting another Muslim army. All right. Meanwhile, they should instead take up arms against the British because it's the British that are fighting their brothers in the Middle East. They're, of course, arrested and interned, sent off into exile into various places. Meanwhile, the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, the two major parties that I mentioned earlier, consent to the war effort. They see it as a means by which to leverage influence with the British government. But they argue that this will only continue so long as assurances are given us that at the end of the war, we will receive the degree of representation that we want, that we've been asking for now decades. This leads to the Lucknow Pact in 1916. This is an interesting development because it is initiated by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was a member of the Indian National Congress, a leading member of the Indian National Congress until about 1913, when Congress leaders, particularly Motilal Nehru, who is Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India's father, convinced him to join the Muslim League. Now, Jinnah said, "I don't want to join the Muslim League. They only represent Muslims. I believe in this larger India." But he joins the Muslim League with the express intent of negotiating a pact between the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress, saying that we will join forces and together we will agree on a formula for a future independent constitution of India that will safeguard the interests of minorities while also winning independence for the majority. A very important step, and it's basically World War I and all of the other issues that I've been outlining that give it voice, that allow this to happen. When the war ends, however, we see the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms put in place, negotiated beginning 1918 and then implemented as the Government of India Act in 1919, which fall far, far short of anything that the British had promised by way of representation to any of these parties. They set up a diarchy in the provinces. Ultimately, it's complicated, but the state, the colonial authorities have control of the province, but on a local level, on a district level councils may be elected locally. So it's very little power. And these big national parties argue ultimately that it doesn't serve their purposes at all. So as we enter 1919, the situation is already tense. The Ottoman Empire is being dismembered. Professor Kohler talked about the Treaty of Versailles and the manner in which it leads into the mandate system and so on. People are following this in South Asia very, very closely and are very much upset by the turn of events that are taking place. Again, the fact that their activism for the past 5 years has been completely ignored in terms of British handling of the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, as popular sentiment increasingly becomes anti-British, we see the Rowlatt Act, which indefinitely extends the Defense of India Act. In other words, it says the war is over, that was an emergency measure, but we now need to establish this particular condition with controls over the press and so on indefinitely into the future. This leads directly to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Gandhi, I don't need to introduce him to anybody, I think. He returns to India from South Africa in 1915. He's part of the want ultimately to see representation, to see a change in government. So he also is not particularly happy with all of this. And he calls for strikes against what he terms the Black Acts, the Rowlatt Act. And people respond across South Asia. There are demonstrations all over the place. But in Amritsar, in the Punjab, in the west of the region, people gather for the Baisakhi festival on April 19th. And these celebrations merge with the anti-colonial demonstrations. And thousands of people gather in this park, basically known as Jallianwala. And the British colonel in charge of the British Indian Army Reserve in that area comes in and opens fire on the crowd. 1,000+ people are killed and many, many more injured. After all of this happens, there's further outrage because he's granted indemnity by the British government. A tribunal is held, a kind of commission to investigate the matter, but it is given no teeth to actually prosecute Dyer or anybody else. And in fact, pro-empire elements within Britain laud him as a hero, and he is seen very well by much of the general population. So what this leads to is the founding of what's known as the Khilafat Committee of the Muslim League. In fact, there's a coup within the Muslim League. The more quietist, loyalist old guard is overthrown by a young, youthful set of Muslim leaders who take up the cause of that old Anjuman, the servants of the Kaaba. Some of the members also join, along with a group known as the Jamaat-e-Ulama-e-Hind, which is a kind of assembly of the major theological schools of Islam in South Asia. And they demand that the British government uphold the Ottoman Caliph's authority over Mecca and Medina or face mass mobilization. Significantly, Gandhi, who is calling for strikes and so on as well, now attends the Khilafat conference. And he assures the Khilafat leaders that if they support his movement, he will support their movement. And so begins the non-cooperation movement, which includes backing from the Indian National Congress, the Khilafat Committee, and multiple other organizations of influence in South Asia at the time. Significantly, women's groups participate on a very large scale here. All of the major demonstrations include women from various communities marching alongside men in all of these different activities. The demand is nothing short of independence, right? We want the British out. And the method is ultimately from the Swadeshi movement, boycott in Swadeshi, and Satyagraha. Now, Swadeshi, to just speak a little bit more about this, involves the idea of one's own. So the idea of khadi clothing or homespun clothing. Gandhi is famous, of course, for his spinning wheel, and so forth. Satyagraha is a Gandhian concept, the idea of truth force. So it goes beyond simply a political tool, but Gandhi sees this as a means to establishing a society by the invocation of truth rather than falsehood, or by knowledge rather than ignorance, and so on. A rather mystical concept in that sense. What I have up here is a newspaper clipping and a poster from for one event that took place in Bombay in 1921. And as you can see, boycott of foreign clothes. The event includes a bonfire of foreign clothes, and it calls on all participants to come in Swadeshi clothes of khadi, of homespun fabric. These kinds of events take place all over South Asia, and they are sustained from 1920 all the way till 1922. In 1922, what we see is that as part of one of these demonstrations, a mob in support of non-cooperation comes into conflict with some police forces. They then attack a police station and kill the policeman inside, set fire to the station. Gandhi right away and unilaterally calls off the entire non-cooperation movement. Now, he pulls a Briton here. He does not consult the Indian National Congress. He does not consult the Muslim League. He does not consult any of the other players who have supported the non-cooperation movement and brought out millions of people to demonstrate. This creates a great deal of ill will between the various parties. Even the Indian National Congress is not happy with Gandhi. You cannot act in this unilateral manner. But Gandhi, remember, is out to bring about change through truth force, right? Satyagraha. He basically is uncompromising when it comes to any form of violence. All of the other players are saying to him, we will continue and we'll ensure that there are no more violent acts, but ultimately we need to have a say in all of this. And Gandhi absolutely refuses. So that brings an end to the non-cooperation movement. It also foreshadows the end of the Khilafat movement, which labors on for another 2 years, using Gandhian methods, by the way. But it ends in 1924 when the Turkish nationalists abolish the Ottoman Sultanate altogether. So they now, their icon is gone, their rallying point is gone. But ultimately, why does this make 1919 a pivotal year? In conclusion, we can say, first of all, it's the first mass movement under the banner of India. All right. It's also not since 1858 that we have seen anything in the type of scale of participation of people from all classes, men and women and so forth, in a concerted effort to unseat the British. So it's the dawn of populist politics and also of Gandhi's influence over the course of those politics and a very important segment of the Indian National Congress as well. And it also illustrates that these methods are effective. The British government is forced to make concessions. Again, they don't go as far as you would expect or as the locals would have wanted, but they do make concessions in increments in Government of India acts that follow. Finally, we need to consider the historical implications as well. From the Indian nationalist perspective, the history of colonialism and the divisions and partition that arise out of it are described in terms of the British having a divide and rule policy. But as Gandhi recognized, we divide and they rule, all right? In other words, the divide and rule policy is a very simplistic nationalist explanation for what's going on. Instead, what we need to think about is all of the various factors that we have spoken of. The rise of an indigenous middle class, if you like, capital holding class, the fact of the capitalization of the economy, the manner in which the civilizing mission brings about social and political reform that is ultimately rooted in Enlightenment thinking, nationalist politics, and so on, which are themselves inherently contradictory in certain ways and pose huge problems in terms of their applicability in the South Asian setting. So, was partition inevitable? Well, the cooperation of 1919 shows that it certainly wasn't. And in fact, it's those with the most religious of religious rhetoric that have come together here. So we can hardly say that partition was ultimately a feature of religious resentments, of Hindus and Muslims perennially hating each other. Instead, as many scholars have pointed out, we cannot even understand partition in terms of the separatism of Muslims, but rather the exclusion of Muslims from the broader idea of the Muslim nation, which more and more is, through this period, articulated and defined in terms of the Hindu majority. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes if there are any questions I can answer. Yes, Anna. Well, there were a series of Mopla revolts, right? And ultimately, I think the manner in which to consider them more generally is as part of the revolts that take place across South Asia that are in one way or another driven by the structural changes that are taking place. As you said, they're ultimately Muslim masses directing their ire against Hindu landlords. In other places, we see revolts that are Hindu masses directing their ire against maybe a Muslim, quote-unquote, factory owner, or manufacturer, or something of that kind. Exactly, indigo planters, and so on. So I see Mopla rebellions in terms of this broader response, haphazard in certain ways, to the structural changes that are taking place. In many respects, even the 1857 uprising can be put within that context. The reason why it's in the central lands is because they are the lands that are ultimately going through the greatest economic depression at the time relative to the coastal areas and so on. I hope that answers the question. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yes. No. Yes. It completely transformed the education provided. Basically, prior to the introduction of the British system, what we have is a huge network of schools of different ranks and classes throughout South Asian society, teaching in Persian, in Arabic, in Sanskrit, in local vernaculars, some being vocational, some being higher education, training clerics, training judges, training administrators in different states, and so on. So there's a vast network of schools that are supported by the local states that are in place. The Mughal government, for example, alienated no less than 3% of its gross product, basically, for nothing other than the education of the indigent. And this is one of the the wealthiest states in the world. Significant sum. That's beyond anything else that's being put towards education more broadly. So when the East India Company starts taking over territories that were formerly governed by the local rulers, whoever they were, one of the first things that they do is say, well, let's look at the education system and let's see from our utilitarian lens whether it's useful or not. So when they look at the local educational institutions, they say, well, they're teaching non-European stuff, so they're useless. So what they do is take away what are known as waqfs, the endowments for all of these institutions. They absolutely take them away. In 1813, there's as part of the East India Company Charter, 100,000 rupees is devoted to education of Indians. This is compared to billions of rupees previously spent. So on the one hand, you have local institutions just being decimated. And on the other hand, you have a very slow and gradual increase of English education. And that English education can never reach the mass population. So you also end up with creating a bifurcated society of elites and upper middle class who are Western in English morals and manner and virtue and so on, and the masses who are just uneducated. Most studies today suggest that throughout the colonial period, if we go from the collapse of the Mughal Empire to the end of the British Empire, we actually see, for most of this period, a decline in literacy rates across South Asia, which only then starts to pick up towards the end of the British period, as more vernacular schools are opened and so on. No, the schools are not closed. Yeah, the schools continue to work. There's obviously change over time, but I think the essential foundation of the idea of the nation in South Asia is established here in 1919. The idea ultimately of Gandhi wanting to appeal to the masses and get them involved and identify as part of the Indian nation using Sanskrit terminology. All right. Meanwhile, the Muslim leaders using Arabic, Farsi, Urdu terminology. So you can see the foundations are already in place. It doesn't mean the inevitability of partition, but what it means is that these are the parties who have to negotiate power sharing. It's not going to be negotiated on other grounds by other parties. I think we need to leave it there. Thank you very much.